Today, I'd like to talk about a few different questions. Is God, the unmoved mover, intelligent? How does God understand? What does God understand? And what is truth? And to help us in these discussions, I'm going to be exploring a wonderful work, the Summa Contra Gentiles of Thomas Aquinas. So, is the unmoved mover intelligent? You might think that the unmoved mover is simply a force, a kind of first cause that doesn't know anything and can't know anything. But Aquinas answers this question with a yes. He notes that every mover moves through a form at which it aims. But God is the first unmoved mover, so God moves through a form. But one cannot apprehend a form without intelligence, so God must be intelligent. Recall from our earlier discussions that God orders the universe. God is not just a mover, but a mover who imparts order on the universe. But a mover who is imparting an order is aiming at something, namely aiming at creating a sort of order. So if God is really the first unmoved mover who orders things, well, God must be doing this through a form. But you can't apprehend a form, you can't have a goal, you can't seek a purpose without intelligence. So God must be intelligent. Another principle that Aquinas would appeal to is the principle that effects cannot be greater than their causes. But clearly there are intelligent effects in the world. That is to say, there are creatures like you and me. And so their ultimate cause must also be intelligent. If Aquinas is right that God has every perfection, and if it's true that intelligence is a perfection, well, then God must be intelligent. And whatever is ordered is the result of intelligence. But we see that there is an order found in nature, which is not caused by itself, but which it requires an intelligence to impart its order. And the ultimate orderer of the universe is, as it were, God, the unmoved mover, the first cause. So if any of these arguments are correct, then the unmoved mover, the first cause, the necessary being, must be intelligent. But now a new problem arises. How could it be that God understands? We talked before about God as the uncaused cause of being a pure actuality, having no potency at all. But this seems to cause great problems for the idea that God is intelligent. So we come to understand things by being open and receptive to them. If I want to understand what's written in the book, I've got to open the book up and read the letters there. My eyes have to be receptive to what's on the page. If I want to hear something on the radio, again, I have to listen to it. My ears have to be open and receptive to receiving the information. And so when we learn things, we come to understand these things by being open and receptive. But God is not open. That is to say, God is absolutely perfect and fully actualized and doesn't have potency. So if that's right, God is not receptive because God has no passive potency whatsoever. God can't change. So how could the unmoved mover move from not understanding to understanding? So these questions raise problems for Aquinas' understanding of who God is. It seems that either God is not intelligent, but then Aquinas provided a number of reasons for thinking God is intelligent, or maybe Aquinas is wrong about God's nature, that God, in fact, is a being like us that's composed of act and potency. So how does Aquinas get out of these difficulties? Aquinas seeks to answer the question, how does God understand? And his answer is quite amazing. As you'd expect, the way God understands is quite different than the way that human beings understand. So according to Aquinas, God's act of understanding is his essence. For us human beings, our essence is not the same as our act of understanding. So I existed as a 1-year-old, but as a 1-year-old, you might say I understood very little, if anything. So we can exist and not understand anything. But what Aquinas is saying here is that God's very essence is God's act of understanding, and God's act of understanding is his essence. Now, God is unchangeable, and so his understanding must also be unchangeable. So God is very different than we are. We go from not knowing to knowing. We learn things, but God doesn't change. And so God doesn't go from not knowing to knowing. God knows everything that God knows in an unchangeable way. God's mind, in other words, is not part of a composed being, but is the entirety of the divine being. And the way God understands, Aquinas says, is through nothing other than his essence. So we understand through our senses, right? I begin to understand things through seeing things, through hearing things, through tasting things. But God, Aquinas says, understands through his essence. If his understanding were through something other than his essence, well, then God would be in potency to that other thing. But as we saw before, God lacks all potency and so does not understand through anything other than his own essence. So on Thomas's view, God's knowledge and human knowledge are radically distinct. God understands all things at once. This is obviously very different than how we understand things. If we're reading a book, we understand the first line of the book and then the next line and so on, and we understand one thing after the other in time. But Aquinas' idea is that God understands all things together at once. And this can be challenging to understand, but this little analogy might help a little bit. When I first started to read, I would sound out each letter and then slowly put together a word. So I might sound out the sentence, Pat hit the ball. And, it took me a while to figure out what the P, what sound that made, and what sound the A makes, what sound the T makes, and then blend them all together and you get the word Pat. Now, once I became a better reader, I could read the whole word Pat all at once. And I've actually taken a speed reading course, so I could probably read the whole sentence, Pat hit the ball, all at once, right? 3 words all at once. Now, if I were a champion speed reader, I could read not 3 words, but maybe 10 words or 12 words or even more words all at once, all in one act of understanding. I would take it all in. So imagine a super powerful intellect that could read all the words of a book all at once in one act of understanding. Well, on Aquinas' view, God is something even beyond the super powerful reader. God understands all things that are present to us, all things that are past to us, all things that are future to us, all in one eternal act of understanding. And this is obviously very different than us. We understand one thing at a time. We understand this book, and then we put it down and pick up a different book, and then put that down, and then listen to the radio. So our understanding is sequential. God's knowledge also differs from ours in that it is not discursive or habitual. Discursive means moving from one thing to the other. So in human understanding, we can go from, say, the premise, all men are mortal, and the premise, Socrates is a man, and then conclude Socrates is mortal. We move from one premise to the next. And we also have habitual knowledge. So I wasn't thinking about my mom's birthday, but then all of a sudden I started thinking about that. And so that kind of knowledge, like when your mom is born or what your middle name is or where your toothbrush is, presumably you weren't thinking about any of those things until I mentioned them. You did know them, but you didn't know them actually. You knew them only habitually. And so Aquinas thinks that God's knowledge is very different than that. It's not discursive, because to have discursive knowledge requires that you go from potentially knowing something to actually knowing something. And as we said, God's knowledge is not like that. And it's also not habitual, because habitual knowledge is potentially something that you're thinking about actually. And so God's knowledge is very different than our own. God also does not understand by composing and dividing, but we do. So sometimes we compose, we put 2 things together, all men, and we put that together with our mortal. And sometimes we divide and we say, no man is 25 feet tall. God doesn't understand in that sort of way, by composing and dividing. God's understanding is in one eternal act that isn't brought about by composing and dividing, which of course are a number of acts. So what does God understand? Well, first of all, Aquinas says God understands himself perfectly. Why? Well, remember I said that God's understanding is God's essence. So there's a perfect unity between God's mind and God's reality. And so God, first of all, understands himself perfectly. Understanding is a unity of the one understanding and the one being understood. So if I understand you, that means there's a unity between me, who's understanding, and the thing being understood, namely you. So understanding is a kind of unity between the mind and some reality. And God perfectly understands himself because there's a perfect unity between God's mind and God's essence. In fact, God's mind is God's essence. So Aquinas holds that God primarily and essentially knows only himself. He is knowing himself primarily and essentially because before there was anything even created, God knew himself. God has always been a knower. And one of the reasons he thinks this is that he says the thing understood is the perfection of the one understanding. That is to say, if I really know something, if I know that 2 + 2 is 4, if I know that force equals mass times acceleration, that perfects me. I'm better off knowing truths about the world. So if God didn't understand through his intellect, then he would be perfected by something other than himself, something more noble than he is. But on Aquinas' view, nothing is more noble than God. So God is not perfected by something outside of himself. Now, Aquinas holds that God not only knows himself, but knows all other things in himself. An effect is known when its causes are known, and God knows himself, the cause of all, therefore he knows all the effects. So you might liken God to a mirror, and imagine looking in a mirror, and if you looked in the mirror, you could see everything that is reflected in the mirror. So if God is the first artist, if an artist knows himself perfectly, well, he knows the art that he makes. So if God is the first cause, and he knows himself perfectly as a cause, and he couldn't know himself perfectly as a cause if he didn't know what effects he brought about, well, then God knows not only himself as the first cause, but in knowing himself as first cause, knows all the effects that come from him. He knows himself as a cause, and he cannot know this unless he knows what he causes. Hence, he knows everything that's caused. And God's understanding is, for Aquinas, that he understands all things together. God does not understand one thing and then another thing and then another thing, but rather God has one eternal act of understanding. God, since he's not in time, doesn't understand one thing now and then some other thing later. So this leads to surprising insights, like that God understands you and understands your great-grandmother and understands your great-grandchild all at once in one eternal act of understanding. And the reason for this is that if God were to understand one thing now and another thing later, well, then that would involve potency. But if God is not composed, well, then God doesn't have any potency in understanding. Let's consider a question. What is truth? This is a very famous question that Pontius Pilate asked Jesus. And there are at least two very famous answers given for this idea of what is truth. Aristotle's way of thinking about it was as follows. To say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false. While to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is true. So that he who says of anything that it is or that it is not will say either what is true or what is false. You might boil those words down to saying that truth is a correspondence between what you say and the reality that you're talking about. Another famous understanding of what truth is given by William James, that truth is only the expedient in our way of thinking. Truth is, in other words, whatever is useful, not something that corresponds to reality necessarily. Now, William James, of course, wrote after the time of Aquinas, but I think Aquinas would reject this way of understanding what the truth is. And part of the reason I think he'd reject this is that it's possible to have useful but false beliefs. So, for instance, most people believe they are above average on desirable traits like intelligence, friendliness, and sincerity. But of course, most people can't be above average, right? Most people are average. And yet this useful or this false belief might nevertheless be useful. It might be useful in terms of survival of the species for most people to believe they're above average in desirable traits. Likewise, 93% of US drivers think they're in the top 50% of drivers. So obviously 93% of drivers can't be in the top 50%. So the belief of some of those people is false. But could it be a useful belief? Well, yes, it might be. In other words, it might be the case that if you thought you were in the bottom 50% of drivers, that you wouldn't drive places, and that would be very unuseful not to be able to drive to places. This idea reminds me of a quotation from Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. On the other hand, there are beliefs that are true, but useless. Maybe it's true that you ate a banana at lunch on December 4th, 2020. Well, that's maybe true, but I'm guessing even if it were true, that would be a useless belief. Now, you might have a very far-fetched scenario in which it's extremely useful to know whether you ate a banana at lunch on December 4th, 2020. Maybe you're in a Guinness Book of World Records contest for eating bananas at lunch for the most days in a row, and you're getting the record hinges on whether you ate a banana on that day. But most likely, whether or not you ate a banana on that day is, if it's true, would be a useless belief. It could be the case that you have an odd number of eyelashes right now, or maybe you have an even number of eyelashes right now. Whichever one is true, that belief is useless, right? It doesn't make any difference at all whether you have an odd or an even number of eyelashes. Maybe you crossed the threshold of your room with your right foot, but not your left foot yesterday. Okay, that might be true. Maybe if we had videotape, we could figure it out. But again, that belief, even if it were true, would be useless. The exact number of molecules of water in your cup, right? We might be able to figure that out. That would be another example of a true but useless belief. Bertrand Russell, I think, is right when he says, when we say that a belief is true, the thought we wish to convey is not the same thought as when we say that the belief furthers our purposes. Thus, true does not mean furthering our purposes. So, if we think of true as a correspondence between mind and reality, Aquinas is going to argue that God is truth. If we think of truth as this unity of mind and reality, well, God's mind and God's reality are united. In fact,